Good morning, everyone. Today, we will be presenting on comparisons between damages and specific performance as remedies in contract law. So, particularly focusing on circumstances where court may refuse to grant specific performance. Contract law is important as it ensures agreements between parties are legally enforceable. When a party breaches a contract, the law provides remedies to protect the innocent party and compensate for losses suffered. One common remedy is damages, which involves monetary compensation. Another remedy is specific performance, where it is an equitable remedy, where the court orders a party to perform their contractual obligations exactly as agreed. So, specific performance is usually granted when damages are inadequate, especially in cases involving unique property or subject matter. However, this remedy is discretionary, meaning courts will consider fairness, justice, practicality before granting it. So, I will pass to the next presenter. Thank you.
Alright everyone, so as a law student, obviously we are familiar with the remedies for breach of contract and especially damages and also specific performance who are among the important remedies available in law. And today, I would like to explain about what exactly damages is all about. So, what actually is damages? So, in simple words, damages refer to money that the court orders to the party to pay to another party who has suffered loss, injury, or harm. So, the main purpose of damages is to compensate the injured party. And also, according to George Washington Field in a book of a treatise on the law of damages, damages can also be referred as the estimated reparation in money for detrimental injury sustained, which means that compensation given in the form of money to a person who has suffered because of another person's wrongdoing. And not only, so now actually damages are not only applicable in breach of contract, but also in several other situations. For instance, obviously we have the breach of contract cases where the situation damages can be awarded when one party fails to perform their obligations under a contract. Secondly, damages also applicable in law of tort, where this happens when a person suffer harm on another person's wrongful act or negligence. Besides that, damages can also be awarded in a case involving human rights violations. So when a person's rights or freedoms are unlawfully violated, the court may grant damages as compensation for humiliation, emotional distress, or suffering experienced by the victim. Also, lastly, damages are also relevant in property or commercial disputes. So, for instance, cases involving defective goods, non-delivery products, or also financial losses in business transaction. So, in this situation, damages help compensate the affected party for the economic losses suffered and restore them.
Hello, my name is Nurhana binti Hassan with the matric ID of DIL 242012. Alright, I am Nurhana and I will be continuing today's presentation in regards to specific performance. So before we go into the complexities of circumstances where specific performance is applicable, I would just like to briefly explain what specific performance definition actually is. To explain to you, our dear viewer, specific performance is generally a contractual remedy where courts compel a party to perform their obligations as agreed in the contract. So that is the basis. This remedy is most commonly applied in circumstances, contracts or cases where damages or monetary compensation, financial compensation is inadequate. So what does this actually mean, you may ask? Take this for example. Let's say that you have a contract that involves a unique subject matter, like for example, land. Land is a unique subject matter. So by giving that affected party damages or monetary compensation, it doesn't actually allow for the substitution of the land, because the land itself has a unique value. So damages are not actually appropriate. So as I've mentioned to you, the concept of unique subject matter, I will be repeating this phrase throughout the presentation. So to just briefly explain this, unique subject matter is simply something that has a non-fungible or irreplaceable value, or you could say it is a one and only type of concept. You could see this most commonly, most typically in lands like immovable property, but also conversely like historical goods, artifact, or even custom-made arts. So those are also considered as a unique subject matter. So specific performance is also actually under the umbrella branch of an equitable remedy. So equitable remedy translates to equity, and equity aims to achieve fairness. So specific performance aims to reinstate fairness in such contracts. So in relation to this, specific performance is granted at the court's discretion. Court's discretion meaning that they may also grant or disallow specific performance if the situation is inappropriate. Therefore, specific performance is not exactly available as an automatic right. So moving on to the 3.2 explanation of the specific performance of today is circumstances or application of specific performance, or where they are actually applicable. So let's take the first instance into this subtopic, which is contracts involving immovable property. So you may ask, as I mentioned earlier in the previous example regarding the definition, immovable property could be taken examples such as land. So the gist of specific performance in this context is that it may also be applicable to contracts involving immovable property, like not just land, but also the minerals or oils beneath the land, or even commercial properties such as buildings. So those are considered actually also under the branch of immovable property. So why specific performance applies is that the nature of immovable property itself is unique. There will be no other item, as I mentioned earlier, that could perfectly replicate or substitute it. So if you still do not understand what I'm trying to say is, how about we try to explain this through practical examples. So as everyone can see in the slides, is that in the case of Tan Ah Tong and Parvin Kao, the case actually involved a landed property, which is material to our discussion. The court the principle here, and the most important here lies in the judgment and what the court said. The court said that specific performance is granted because damages were not adequate to compensate such immovable property. So the basis here is supported legally with the case. Conversely, we could also see this in the Specific Relief Act 1950 under Section 11, subsection 2. So what does this section actually state? And how is it important to our discussion today in regards to immovable property? So take this. This section explicitly states that there is a presumption that monetary compensation is inadequate to remedy immovable property. So the wording usage of presumption means that it may be rebutted. Okay? So what is a circumstance that the presumption could successfully be made in terms of immovable property? Because it has also been stated that commonly these immovable properties have a unique nature. For example, to make you, our dear viewer, understand, let's say that in the contract there is an express clause that states specific performance may not be granted in the event of breach, or the contract itself is somewhat faulty from the start. So this will further be elaborated in circumstances where court may refuse specific performance later on with our fellow members. Financial compensation usually cannot satisfy the affected parties' expectations because they were already presented with what the fulfillment of the contractual obligation could have given them to specify the benefits itself. So, in this context, what I mean by expectation, if damages are sufficient to remedy a breach, like they could actually receive what the contract had offered them with a replica item, then there would be no need to call for specific performance. This sentiment is legally reflected in Section 11, Subsection 1, Paragraph C of Specific Relief Act 1950. So, particularly, this particular section recognizes circumstances where monetary compensation are unable to remedy a breach. So, take this for instance. If it can be easily substituted in the open market, then there is no need for specific performance. But an adequate example in relation and abiding to Section 11, Subsection 1, Paragraph C is in the context of non-fungible items being the subject matter of the contract. So because of this particular unit value, it makes damages become inadequate and therefore align with the situations that are generally the gist of what I'm trying to explain about Section 11, Subsection 1, Paragraph C of Specific Relief Act 1950. So just lightly conclude on this small point is, as I've said about the non-fungible item, this justifies the application of specific performance being granted discretionarily by the courts. So the third point of today's presentation is actually no standard in ascertaining actual damage. So specific performance is also applicable in such cases. What I meant by no standard here is where breach of contract, when breach of contract occurs, that there is difficulty in ascertaining damages, meaning that financial losses cannot be accurately assessed. So this commonly applies in contracts that involve unique subject matter, and as I've said multiple times, the difficulty of calculating the monetary value of the extent of actual damage caused. So yes, I know that our dear viewer might be feeling confused over the repetitive explanations, so I will just be putting on practical and legal basis examples. The first is seen in Section 11, Subsection 1, Paragraph B of Specific Relief Act 1950. So this section explicitly establishes that courts may exercise discretion in granting specific performance where there is no actual standard or that is available in determining the extent of damages caused by the breach. So yes, no existing standard means that it's hard to actually verify how much this damage caused to the contract itself. How about I explain this to you further with a practical case example, which is reflected in the case of Adderley and Dixon. So in the case of Adderley and Dixon, the case actually revolved around the sale of debts conducted between the plaintiff and the defendant. So the plaintiff agreed to sell these debt rights to the defendant. However, the defendant at the final moment refused to honor this agreement and refused to pay the purchase price or honor their part of the contract. So the most important basis here in relation to our topic is how court granted specific performance. And why did the court grant specific performance in such a case? Because the value of debts and dividends, or the future dividends, were actually hard to assess monetarily. Okay, and on the second basis is that in the context, if the court granted damages instead to the plaintiff, the damages would only be given on the basis of guesswork, which is what the court did not want to give to the plaintiff because that would be unfair to them. And the implication of this case is that provided that if the courts actually did go through with damages instead of specific performance, the plaintiff would be forced to sell these rights at an uncertain price, therefore going against the concept of equity or fairness. So, to close, specific performance applicable to what contracts is with this final point, which is acts to be done in performance of trust. basis of what I'm trying to say here in this point is that specific performance may also be granted in matters involving trust obligations. Under Section 2 of Specific Relief Act 1950, trust is referred to as a fiduciary relationship involving property. So, this equitable remedy, that is specific performance, is applicable when the transfer of property is incomplete, one, or when the trustee refuses or fails to deliver their fiduciary obligations by not transferring this property or whatnot to the rightful beneficiary. For example, if you still don't understand what I'm trying to say, is let's say that a trustee refuses to transfer a property that was given to them under the basis of their fiduciary obligations. So, they do not want to give this to the beneficiary. So this in itself is a breach of a trust obligation because it is part of what they are supposed to do, but they refuse to do. In this context, the courts may exercise discretion in granting specific performance so that the obligations of the trust would not only be fulfilled, but also reinstate fairness towards the beneficiary. A legal basis to support what I have just said is Section 11, Subsection 1, Paragraph A of Specific Relief Act 1950. So this section particularly recognizes acts to be wholly or partly done in performance of trust. In this context, courts may also take this obligation, fiduciary obligation to be specific, in consideration of whether or not to grant specific performance.
Assalamualaikum, my name Nur Zidatul Alisha binti Yazid. My matric card number DIL 212029. Thank you, Hannah, for explaining for the application of specific performance. Now, I will continue with difference and comparison between damages and specific performance. Firstly, damages are a common law remedy that provides monetary compensation to the innocent party for losses suffered due to breach of contract. The main purpose of damages is to place the innocent party in the position they would have been in if the contract had been properly performed. Damages are commonly applied in ordinary commercial contracts where monetary compensation is considered sufficient, while specific performance is an equitable remedy where the court orders a party to perform the contractual obligation exactly as agreed. This remedy is usually granted when the subject matter is unique or irreplaceable, such as land or special property where damages are inadequate. Both remedies differ in terms of nature, application, enforcement, and the court's discretion in granting the remedy. Next, I will explain the difference between damages and specific performance in detail. Firstly, damages and specific performance differ in terms of their nature. Damages are a common law remedy that provides monetary compensation for losses caused by breach of contract. The focus is on financial restoration rather than forcing actual performance. This principle can be seen in Angki Sim against Kembang Jaya Development Sdn Bhd, where the courts focus on compensation based on the actual loss suffered. While for specific performance is an equitable remedy where the court compels a party to perform the contract exactly as agreed, and the emphasis is on actual performance instead of monetary compensations. Both remedies differ in terms of the court's approach. Damages are generally ordered once breach and loss are proven. The court mainly determines the amount of compensation to be awarded. This can be seen in Kamalanatan Punubalan against Tenaga Nasional Berhad, where the court focused on proving and quantifying the loss suffered. However, specific performance is discretionary. The court may refuse to grant the remedy even if a valid contract exists, especially where the measures are considered adequate or enforcement will be unfair. The remedies also differ based on the subject matter involved. Damages are suitable when substitute performance is available in the market, particularly in ordinary commercial transactions, while specific performance is usually granted where the subject matter is unique or irreplaceable, such as land or special property. This principle is illustrated in Biswick against Biswick, where damages were considered inadequate. There is also a difference in enforcement. Damages are easier to enforce because they only involve payment on money, Once compensation is paid, the court's involvement ends. In contrast, specific performance may require continuous court supervision to ensure compliance. In Cooperative Insurance Society Limited against Argyle Stores, the court refused to grant specific performance because supervising continuous obligation was impractical. Damages are commonly used in commercial contracts because they are practical and efficient. Specific performance is more suitable case involving land or fiduciary obligations. In Tan Ah Tong against Pravin Kaur, the court granted specific performance because of the unique nature of immovable property. While damages remain available in employment or personal service contracts because they provide compensation without forcing performance. However, specific performance is generally unavailable in personal service contracts because it may interfere with personal liberty and is difficult for the court to supervise continuously. I will now move on to the comparison between damages and specific performance. Firstly, damages are commonly applied in ordinary commercial contracts where goods or services are easily available in the market. Monetary compensation is considered sufficient because the innocent party can obtain substitute performance without requiring the court to enforce actual performance of the contract. This reflects the common law approach where damages functioned as the primary remedy to compensate loss rather than compel performance. In contrast, specific performance is applied where damages are inadequate to fully protect the innocent party. Under Section 11 of the Specific Relief Act 1950, contracts involving land may be specifically enforced because monetary compensation may not accurately reflect the true value of the subject matter. Next, damages are commonly used in commercial transactions because they provide certainty and are easier to assess in monetary terms. Once breach or loss are proven, the court only needs to calculate the amount of compensation without supervising the performance of the contract. Damages are considered practical and efficient in business dealings. However, specific performance is more suitable in cases involving land or fiduciary obligation where the subject matter is unique. In Cooperative Insurance Society Limited against Argyle Stores, the court refused to grant specific performance because continuous supervision by the court would be impractical. While in Tan Ah Tong against Pravin Kaur, the court granted specific performance in a land transaction due to the unique nature of immovable property. The application of both remedies depends on the adequacy of damages. If damages are sufficient, specific performance will usually not be granted. However, where damages are inadequate or difficult to estimate, the court may grant specific performance to ensure fairness between the parties. This reflects the equitable principle that specific performance is an exceptional remedy. Damages remain available in personal service or employment contracts because they provide monetary compensation without forcing a person to continue performing obligations. In contrast, specific performance is generally unavailable in personal service contracts because it may interfere with personal liberty and continuous obligation are difficult for the courts to supervise. This concludes on the difference and comparison between damages and specific performance. That's all from me. Now I will pass to Hannah to continue. Thank you.
So, I would just like to extend my thanks to the previous presenter for presenting their part in relation of today's topic. So, I will be continuing for the material part of today's presentation, in which the question asks, what is the circumstances where courts refuse specific performance despite contract validity? So in this part, there will be multiple branches that will be explained by myself and a fellow member called Said Harith. So without further ado, let's just begin with the first basis where courts may refuse specific performance. The first and the most obvious one that is the most mentioned in today's presentation, particularly my part, is where damages are considered an adequate remedy. So, as you all know, specific performance only applies where damages are considered insufficient. Not only damages, but generally where common law remedies are insufficient, but most particularly damages itself. This particularly implies that damages are the most common form of remedy in the context of common law. Okay? So, therefore, it is easy to understand that where damages are sufficient or capable of putting parties, the affected party, in the position that they would have been if not caused by the breach of contract or the unfulfillment of the contract of the other party, then specific performance need not be applied. The legal basis for what I have just said is under Section 20, subsection 1, paragraph A of Specific Relief Act 1950. So in this context, it does establish that courts would not be particular in enforcing or generally or simply they would just refuse to grant specific performance in context if damages are considered enough to satisfy parties caused by the breach itself. So because of how I have already explained the examples of where damages could be adequate, there is no need for me to apply more and compact your understanding too much. So I will be passing on my part to the next member, and thank you for hearing my presentation of the day.
Okay, thank you. Next, the next instance where court may refuse specific performance is where contracts involve personal services. These contracts usually depend heavily on personal qualification, skill or personal willingness to perform the obligation. For example, contracts requiring an author to complete a novel or an artist to produce artwork depend greatly on individual talent and personal violation. Compelling unwilling parties to continue an employment or personal service relationship may create practical difficulties and may also affect the quality of performance. Section 20, subsection 1, paragraph B of the Specific Relief Act 1950 recognizes that such contracts are generally unsuitable for specific performance. This also relates to the equitable maxim. Equity will not act in vain, because courts are unwilling to continuously supervise performance, especially where the quality depends on personal skills. Therefore, granting specific performance in such circumstances would often be impractical. So, the next circumstance is where the plaintiff has acted unfairly, also known as the doctrine of clean hands. So, specific performance is So the plaintiff must act honestly and fairly before seeking relief in court. This principle is based on the equitable maxim: he who comes to equity must come with clean hands. Okay, if the plaintiff commits fraud, misrepresentation, conceals important facts, or behaves unfairly towards the defendant, the court may refuse to grant specific performance. This is because equity is based on fairness and justice, and courts will not assist parties who act improperly. Therefore, even if a valid contract exists, the court may still refuse specific performance due to plaintiff's unfair conduct. Other than that, we also have the doctrine of laches. Court may refuse to grant specific performance where the plaintiff delays unreasonably in enforcing their rights. Since specific performance is an equitable remedy, the plaintiff must act promptly and without unnecessary delays. This principle is based on the maxim: equity aids the vigilant, not those who sleep on their rights. If the plaintiff delays for too long, circumstances may change, and granting specific performance may become unfair to the defendant. For example, property values may increase significantly, or the defendant may already make other arrangements based on the delay. Therefore, unreasonable delay may prevent the plaintiff from obtaining specific performance. Okay, The final circumstances is undue hardship to the defendant. Courts may refuse specific performance where enforcement would cause serious hardship towards or unfairness towards the defendant. So, since specific performance is an equitable remedy, courts will consider whether granting the order would be fair and reasonable. Hardship may arise due to illness, financial difficulties, major changes in defendant's circumstances. In such situations, damages may be considered a more appropriate remedy instead. That is all from me. Now I'll pass to the next presenter. Thank you.
And now, here we are in terms of how the court actually apply or dismiss the claim, which will be explained by me and also Shamil. So, starting off strong with damages, where the court successfully used damages as the remedy for the cases. So, in the case of Kamalantan, Honam Balan, and Tenaga Nasional Berhad, where damages were successfully applied under the law of contract, because the court had actually found that the defendant, Tenaga Nasional Berhad, had breached its contractual obligations toward the plaintiff. So in this case, there were actually a valid contract between the plaintiff and also the defendant for the supply of electricity to the plaintiff's residence. So under this agreement, the defendant had a duty to provide electricity services lawfully and also according to the provisions under the Electric Supply Act 1990. So, however, the defendant failed to fulfill these obligations when it demanded payment based on estimated charges instead of actual meter readings. So, and repeatedly disconnected the electricity supply despite objection made by the plaintiff. Also, by this case, there were several important criteria that caused the court to actually successfully apply damages in this case. So first, obviously there are clear legal wrong and breach of duty by the defendant. Second, the plaintiff managed to prove that the defendant acted unlawfully. And thirdly, the plaintiff and his family suffered inconvenience. So whenever the another party had suffered inconvenience, the court may ask for damages where the one party need to pay money to the other party who had suffered inconvenience, loss, harm or injury, as what I mentioned earlier in the definition of damages. Because of this incident, the court actually found that the defendant action were repeated, deliberate and coercive in nature. And because of the seriousness of the conduct, the court decided that not only compensatory damages should be awarded, but also exemplary damages to punish the wrongful conduct and discourage similar actions in the future.
Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh. And good morning to Madam and greetings to the students. My name is Muhammad Shamil Bedul Kefli and my metric number is DIL 222014. In the case of Handley Bezendel, the plaintiff operated a crankshaft broker. The defendant was hired to transport the crankshaft for repair, but the delivery was delayed. As a result, the plaintiff claimed damage for the loss of profits suffered during the period of delay. The issue before the court was whether the plaintiff was entitled to recover damage for the loss of profits caused by the defendant's delay. The court refused to award damage for the loss of profits. The court found that the defendant had not been informed that the delay would cause the entire mill to cease operations. Therefore, the losses claimed were not reasonably foreseeable by the defendant at the time the contract was met. The criteria has not satisfied because the loss was not reasonably foreseeable. And second, the defendant had no knowledge of the plaintiff's special circumstances. And third, the loss was not within the reasonable contemplation of both parties. In this case, establish that damage can only be recovered for losses that are reasonably foreseeable, and not too remote from the breach of contract. So next we go to the case of Victoria Laundry (Windsor Limited) and Newman Industry Limited. In Victoria Laundry and Newman Industry, the plaintiff purchased a boiler from the defendant for use in its laundry business. However, the defendant delayed the delivery of the boiler, causing the plaintiff to lose business profits and an opportunity to perform several profitable government contracts. The issue of the case was whether the plaintiff could recover damage for all losses, including the profits that would have been earned from the government contracts. In the court decision, the court allowed damage for the ordinary loss of business profits but refused damage for the government contracts. This was because the defendant had no knowledge of those special contracts when the agreement was made. The criteria is not satisfied because the special circumstances were not communicated to the defendant. 2. The extraordinary losses were not reasonably foreseeable. And last, the losses were outside the contemplation of the parties. In the legal principle of this case, the case established that special damage can only be recovered if the defendant knew or ought reasonably to have known about the special circumstances giving rise to the loss. Thank you.
So now I'm going to moving on with the remedy of specific performance, where the court also successfully applied in contract law. So in the case of Angki Sim and Kembang Jaya Development Sendirian Berhad, where specific performance was successfully applied because the court found out that the defendant had breached its contractual obligations towards the plaintiff. So in this case, obviously there was a valid contract between the plaintiff and also the defendant, the Jaya Development Sendirian Berhad, for the sale and purchase of a double-story terrace house. So under the agreement, the defendant had the duty to complete the construction and hand over vacant possession within 24 months. However, the defendant failed to fulfill these obligations when there was a delay of 813 days in delivering the property, and the defendant attempted to justify the delay through an out-of-time application for extension. So there were several important criteria that I would like to highlight in this case, where caused the court to successfully apply specific performance in this case. So firstly, obviously they have the valid and enforceable contract between both parties. Second, the defendant clearly breached an essential term of the agreement by failing to deliver vacant possession within the agreed time. And third, the plaintiff had actually fulfilled or was willing to fulfill his own contractual obligations, especially regarding payment under the agreement. Besides that, the subject matter of the contract involved immovable property, which is considered as unique in contract law. So, which is considered unique in law. So, because land and houses are unique properties, so monetary damages alone were not sufficient to properly compensate the plaintiff. Now, I will ask my friend Shami to actually explain the cases on how the court actually dismissed the claim of specific performance.
In the case of Patel and Ali, the defendant agreed to sell her house to the plaintiff under a valid contract. Before completion of the sale, the defendant became seriously ill and suffered a disability. The plaintiff then applied for an order of specific performance to compel the defendant to complete the sale. In the issue of this case was whether the court should grant specific performance despite the hardship that would be suffered by the defendant. In the decision of the court refused to grant specific performance. Although the contract was valid, the contract found that enforcing the sale would cause substantial hardship to the defendant due to her medical condition and personal circumstances. The criteria has not satisfied because enforcement would cause serious hardship. Second, the remedy would be unequitable. And last, the discretionary requirements for specific performance were not fulfilled. And for the legal principle of this case established that specific performance is discretionary equitable remedy and may be refused where enforcement would result in hardship or injustice. And second, in the case of Cooperative Insurance Society and Argyle Stores Holdings Limited, the defendant operated a supermarket in a shopping centre owned by the plaintiff. Under the lease agreement, the defendant was required to keep the supermarket open and trading. However, due to financial losses, the defendant decided to close the business. The plaintiff sought specific performance to compel the defendant to continue operating the supermarket. The issue of the case was whether the court should grant specific performance requiring the defendant to continue running the business. Of the decision of the court, the court refused to grant specific performance. It held that enforcing such an order would require constant supervision by the court and would force the defendant to operate a loss-making business. The criteria has not satisfied because the contract required continuous performance. Second, enforcement would require ongoing court supervision. And third, specific performance was impractical the circumstances. And last, damage were a more appropriate remedy. The legal principle of this case is established that courts generally will not grant specific performance where continuous supervision is required or where the order would be impractical to enforce. So, thank you. So now we go to the final of the topic, which is the conclusion. The conclusion is damages and specific performance are two important remedies in contract law used when a breach of contract occurs. However, both remedies differ in terms of their purpose and application. Firstly, damages is a common law remedy which aims to compensate the innocent party for the losses suffered. Its purpose is to place the injured party in the position they would have been in if the contract had been properly performed. Because losses can usually be measured in monetary terms, damages is the most common remedy awarded by the court. On the other hand, specific performance is an equitable remedy granted at the discretion of the court. Instead of compensation, the court orders the defaulting party to perform the contract exactly as promised. This remedy is usually applied when damages are insufficient, especially in contracts involving unique subject matters such as land or property. However, even if a contract is valid, the court may still refuse to grant specific performance. For example, the court may refuse it where damages are already adequate, where the contract involves personal skill or service, where enforcement will cause hardship or unfairness, or where the contract requires continuous supervision by the court. Therefore, both remedies play an important role in ensuring justice in contract law. Damages provide a practical solution in most cases, while specific performance is used only in exceptional situations where monetary compensation is inadequate. So, that's all from us. Thank you.